Get her out of this room. She doesn't belong here. The Admiral's voice cut through the Pentagon briefing like a blade. Every eye in the room turned toward the woman in the gray service uniform, standing near the door, holding a tray, saying nothing. They saw a worker, a mistake, someone who had wandered into a room she had no right to enter. They told her to leave. She didn't move. What no one in that room understood, not the Admiral, not the colonels, not the intelligence officers lining the walls, was that Maya Whitmore wasn't there to serve them coffee. She was there to end them. If you're watching this story right now, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Let's go. The first time Maya Whitmore walked into Fairgate Naval Command Complex, nobody looked at her twice. That was the point. She wore gray. Not quite a uniform, not quite civilian clothes. The kind of mid-tone nothing that service staff across every military installation in the country had worn for decades. A laminated badge clipped to her left breast pocket, hair pulled back tight, flat-soled shoes, a rolling cart with a thermal carafe, a stack of white ceramic mugs, and a small basket of individually wrapped sugar packets she had counted twice that morning in her hotel room. The badge was real. The cart was real. The sugar packets were real. Everything else about her presence in that building was something else entirely. It was a Tuesday in March when everything began to come apart, though apart isn't quite right. Closer to when things that had already been apart for a long time started colliding with each other at speed. The briefing room on level 4 of the Fairgate complex was designated Secure Conference 7, and it was supposed to hold 14 people that morning. 14 people with verified credentials, cleared backgrounds, and an assigned reason to be there. The subject was classified at a level that most of the officers in the building would never see in their entire careers. Maya knew the subject before she walked through the door. She had known it for 11 months. She maneuvered her cart past the checkpoint with a nod to the guard. Specialist Ferraro, 23 years old, new posting, likely hadn't slept, and settled near the far wall while the room filled. Colonels, a rear admiral, 2 intelligence liaisons from separate agencies who would spend the next 2 hours pretending not to know each other, and a handful of aides who existed mostly to carry folders and absorb blame. She poured coffee. She kept her eyes low. She listened to everything. Admiral Ethan Caldwell arrived 6 minutes late, which she had anticipated. He was the kind of man who arrived exactly as late as his rank permitted, late enough to signal that his time was more valuable than yours, not so late that it looked like disorganization. He was 61, square-jawed, decorated in the specific way that meant he had been in the right places at the right moments throughout a career that had as much to do with political instinct as it did with military brilliance. His uniform was immaculate. His posture announced itself before he spoke. He sat at the head of the table without looking at Maya. That was fine. The briefing began the way classified briefings always began. Slowly, bureaucratically, with someone going over ground rules that everyone already knew. Maya moved around the perimeter of the room, refilling mugs that didn't need refilling, adjusting her position every few minutes without calling attention to herself. The agenda circulated. Subject headers only, no operational details on paper. Everything sensitive was verbal or projected onto the encrypted display panel that faced away from the door. She couldn't see the panel directly. She didn't need to. Colonel Dennis Rourke, sitting third from the left, late 50s, wire-framed glasses, the kind of institutional authority that comes from outlasting the people who used to outrank you, cleared his throat and began the operational summary. His voice had the flattened cadence of someone who had given this type of briefing many times and considered the dramatic weight of the information to be someone else's problem. The Carrion Ridge incident, he said, 12 months post-event. Status of ongoing review. Maya's hand, which had been hovering over a mug at the far end of the table, stilled for exactly 1 second. Then she moved on. Rourke continued. The summary was precise, clinical, and wrong in 3 places she noted immediately. Not wrong in the way of clerical error. Wrong in the way of someone who had been carefully told a version of events and had accepted it without pressure testing a single word. Ghost Unit 7 deployed under standard protocol, Rourke said. Intelligence provided a confirmed target window. The unit was compromised by unknown means. 8 personnel were killed in the resulting engagement. One survivor, extracted under hostile conditions, status ongoing medical review. Status ongoing medical review. That was what they'd written about her. 11 months ago. In a file she wasn't supposed to have read. She had read it anyway. Admiral Caldwell leaned back and folded his hands. What's the current assessment on the intelligence failure? Rourke shuffled his page. Still classified under separate cover. Preliminary indications suggest the compromised data originated at field level. So we're saying the unit leaked their own coordinates. Caldwell's tone wasn't a question. We're saying the breach point has not been confirmed at command level. Same thing, Caldwell said, and several people around the table nodded because that was what you did when the Admiral drew a conclusion. Maya set down the carafe carefully, making no sound. Field level. They had been pushing the blame downward for 11 months, building a paper trail that pointed toward dead men. 8 soldiers who weren't alive to dispute anything. 8 soldiers whose coordinates had been handed to the wrong people by someone in this building or close to it, and who had died in a mountainside ambush in Afghanistan because of it. She was the 9th. She had not died, which had been inconvenient for someone. The door to the conference room opened. One of Caldwell's aides leaned in and murmured something, and Caldwell held up a finger, one moment, and turned to look at the aide. In doing so, his gaze swept the room, landed on Maya for the first time, and stayed there. She met his eyes for half a second. Neutral expression, service posture. Who authorized additional staff in here? Caldwell asked. Not loudly, the kind of quiet that functions as a threat. Rourke looked up. The other officers looked up. Everyone looked at Maya, and the quality of the attention shifted, from the automatic invisibility of the service worker to something sharper, more assessing. Captain Linda Marsh, one of the intelligence liaisons, checked something on her tablet. She should be cleared for the room, building access, level 3. This isn't a level 3 meeting, Caldwell said. No, Marsh agreed. Caldwell pushed back his chair and turned fully toward Maya. Ma'am, you need to step out. Maya's expression didn't change. Of course, Admiral. Let me collect now, he said. Leave the cart. She set down the carafe. She straightened. She did not move toward the door. I apologize for any confusion, she said. Her voice was even, unhurried. I was assigned to this room by the facility coordinator. If there's been a scheduling error, there's no error, Caldwell said. You're in a secure briefing, you don't have clearance to attend. That's a federal violation, not a scheduling mix-up. Someone from security will escort you to the checkpoint, we'll sort out how this happened, and you can call your supervisor. He glanced at one of the aides. Get someone from building security up here. The aide nodded and stepped out. The room watched. The quality of the silence was the kind that happens when everyone is waiting to see whether the person being dressed down has any dignity left to preserve. Maya looked at Caldwell. She didn't look at the floor. I understand your concern, Admiral, she said. May I ask, is this room currently under standard level 4 clearance requirements, or has it been upgraded? Caldwell blinked. The question surprised him, not because it was aggressive, but because it was precise. Excuse me? For my own records, she said, so I can accurately report to the facility coordinator what the access level is to prevent this from happening again. Something shifted in Caldwell's expression. Not alarm, more like mild recalibration. He was deciding whether she was confused, defiant, or something else he didn't have a word for yet. Level 4 restricted, he said, which you are not cleared for. I understand, Maya said, and she didn't move. Colonel Rourke let out a short breath. Admiral, I can take her down. She's not your problem to manage, Dennis. Caldwell was still looking at her. I'll ask you one more time, Miss Whitmore, she said. Miss Whitmore, do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes, sir. Then I need you to walk out that door. A beat passed. In that beat, something happened that would later be described differently by every person in the room. Some said she smiled. Some said she didn't. Some said her posture changed, became somehow less like a service worker and more like something harder to categorize. Whatever it was small, subtle, the kind of thing that lands differently in retrospect. I'm going to stay a few more minutes, Maya said. If that's all right. The room went very quiet. Caldwell's jaw set. Excuse me? There's a discrepancy in the operational summary that I think the room should hear before I leave, she said, calm as concrete. It'll take 90 seconds. After that, I'll go wherever you need me to. Rourke made a sound. Marsh reached for her tablet. One of the junior colonels on the far side of the table was staring at Maya with the expression of someone trying to identify a familiar face from an unfamiliar context. This woman is a support staffer, Caldwell said, to the room as much as to her. Whatever she thinks she heard, she didn't hear it in a context where her understanding is relevant. The sniper calculation, Maya said. Silence. Colonel Rourke put the effective range of the Ghost unit ambush at 1,400 meters, she said. Standard long-range engagement, but the terrain file for Carrion Ridge, which I've reviewed, puts the nearest viable firing position at 1150 with the cover conditions that existed on the date in question. 1,400 isn't wrong because of a measurement error. It's wrong because it assumes a different origin point, one that places the ambush source outside the perimeter that was designated as secured. Nobody spoke. If the shot came from inside the secured perimeter, she continued, that changes the intelligence failure timeline by approximately 3 hours, which changes where the breach could have originated. Rourke had gone very still. Caldwell was staring at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone whose framework for a situation is cracking under the weight of information it wasn't built to hold. "Who are you?" Marsh said quietly. Before Maya could answer, the door opened. 2 building security officers stepped in, flanking a man in a dark suit, one of the facility's counterintelligence liaisons, a face Maya recognized from her own preliminary research. His name was Garrett. He had 3 commendations and 1 notation in his file for procedural breach that had been quietly buried 6 years ago. He looked at Maya. Then he looked at Caldwell. "Admiral," Garrett said, "we have a problem." Caldwell gestured toward Maya. "Yes, this woman." "Not her, sir." Garrett's voice was controlled, but had the particular flatness of someone delivering news they would rather not deliver. "We ran her badge when she entered the building this morning. Routine log. The system flagged it 40 minutes ago." He paused. "Her clearance level is not level 3. Rourke looked up from his papers. "Her ID tag's at level 5, Garrett said. "Which is—" "I know what level 5 is," Caldwell said. The room temperature seemed to drop. 3 of the officers were exchanging looks. One aide had stopped writing entirely. Captain Marsh had put her tablet down on the table and was looking at Maya with an expression that had moved well past professional assessment into something approaching careful. Level 5 clearance didn't exist for support staff. It barely existed for most of the people in this room. Caldwell turned back to Maya. Whatever impatience had been in his posture before had been replaced by something more careful, controlled. "Who gave you that clearance?" he said. "It was authorized through the appropriate channels," she said. "I want a name." "You'd need to contact the Defense Intelligence Agency's Special Investigations Division for that," she said. "I'm not authorized to disclose the issuing authority in an unsecured verbal exchange. This room is as secured as any room in this complex." "I'm aware," she said. "The problem isn't the room." Another silence. This one felt different from the previous ones. The earlier silences had been moments of confusion, people waiting for the situation to resolve into something familiar. This silence was the silence of people beginning to understand that the situation was not going to resolve into something familiar. Caldwell looked at Garrett. "I want a full verification on this badge. I want her identity confirmed through DIA channels, and I want it done in the next 30 minutes. Garrett nodded and stepped back out. The security officers remained. Caldwell looked at Maya. The impatience was gone. The authority was still there, but it was wearing differently now, like a coat that suddenly felt less suited to the weather. "You're going to sit down," he said, "and you're not going to say another word until I have confirmation of who you are and why you're in this room." "I can do that," Maya said. She sat. It was the first time she had sat down at that table, and the geometry of the room shifted, subtly but unmistakably, to accommodate the fact of her presence rather than her invisibility. The briefing did not resume. The officers waited. Some of them looked at her. Some of them carefully looked away. The junior colonel, who had been studying her face across the table, looked like he was working very hard to remember something. Rourke leaned toward Caldwell and said quietly, but not quietly enough, "She couldn't have had access to the terrain file. That's restricted to mission command and post-incident review." Caldwell said nothing. Maya looked at her hands in her lap. In her left jacket pocket, underneath the carefully folded service cloth she'd placed there for appearances, was a small recording device that had been running since 6:14 that morning. It was the size of a pen cap. It had been modified to operate in a signal-dampened environment and would continue running regardless of whatever electronic countermeasures the room was employing. She had collected 43 minutes of audio since walking through the door. The mention of Carrion Ridge, the suggestion that Ghost Unit 7 had compromised their own coordinates, the casual institutional certainty with which men in this room had been building a version of events that buried 8 dead soldiers under a layer of implication without a single one of them flinching. She had heard it all, and it was exactly what she had needed to hear. The 30 minutes Caldwell had requested passed in segments. Garrett came back at the 12-minute mark to say the badge verification was taking longer than expected. DIA channels were not responding at standard speed, and the issuing authority code attached to Maya's clearance led to a department within the agency that the Fairgate facility's counterintelligence desk did not have direct access to. That, too, was something she had anticipated. "What department?" Marsh asked. Garrett hesitated just slightly. "Special Assessment Office." Marsh went quiet. Rourke said, "I'm not familiar with that office." "Most people aren't," Maya said from her seat against the wall. Caldwell looked at her. "I told you to stop talking." "You told me not to say anything until you had confirmation," she said. "That was 27 minutes ago. You have some confirmation now, even if it's incomplete." "I don't have anything." "You have the fact that my clearance isn't what you assumed it was," she said, "which means your operational briefing has been conducted in front of someone whose access level you underestimated." Caldwell stared at her. "Whatever was discussed in this room in the last 43 minutes," she said, "was discussed with me present and listening. That's not a threat, Admiral. It's a fact. You need to decide what you do with it." The room was silent for a long, stretched moment. And then, from the far end of the table, the junior colonel, who had been staring at her throughout the briefing, a man named Parks, 40 years old, 2 tours in Kandahar, 1 notation in a file that Maya had read twice, said quietly and with a careful lack of inflection, "I've seen that tattoo before." Everyone looked at him. Parks was looking at Maya's wrist, where her sleeve had shifted slightly upward. A small mark. A stylized 7, enclosed in a geometric shape that most people in the world would not recognize. Maya did not pull her sleeve down. She looked at Parks steadily. "Where?" Caldwell said. Parks didn't answer immediately. He was still looking at Maya's wrist. His face had the expression of someone connecting something that they had been trying, on some level, not to connect. "That's a Ghost Unit marker," he said. "I've only seen it on documentation. Classified post-incident review." He looked up from her wrist to her face. "Ghost Unit 7, the unit that was destroyed at Carrion Ridge." The air in the room changed. Caldwell slowly turned from Parks back to Maya. "You said your name was Whitmore," he said. "Yes," she said. "The survivor from Carrion Ridge," Parks said, his voice very flat now, "was listed in the post-incident documentation as Master Sergeant Maya Whitmore," she said, "formerly assigned to Ghost Unit 7, currently operating under a Special Assessment Office mandate, which is why your DIA contact can't pull my file through standard channels." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. It had the quality of a room full of people realizing, simultaneously, that the woman they had ordered to leave, the woman they had talked over, talked around, and talked about as though she weren't capable of understanding a word, had not wandered into the wrong meeting at all. She had walked into exactly the right one, and she had been recording every word they said. Caldwell's mouth opened, closed. The authority in his posture was still there, but it was doing something different now. It was trying to recalculate, trying to find the version of this situation in which he still held the dominant position, and coming up empty. The two security officers near the door had gone very still. Maya looked at the Admiral across the length of the table. "There are some things we need to discuss," she said. Her voice hadn't changed. Still even, still unhurried, still carrying the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment to arrive. "About what happened at Carrion Ridge," she said. "About who was in this room when the mission parameters were briefed. And about why the incident report says the breach originated at field level when the terrain data says otherwise." She reached into her jacket, carefully, visibly, not rushing, and set a small sealed evidence folder on the table in front of her. "I've been patient," she said. "For 11 months I've been patient, and now I need everyone in this room to understand something." She looked at them, at Caldwell, at Rourke, at Marsh, at Parks, at the colonels and aides and intelligence officers who had spent 43 minutes deciding what had happened and who was responsible and how to tell the story. "I didn't survive Carrion Ridge by accident," she said. And outside the sealed door of Secure Conference 7, in the corridor of Level 4 of the Fairgate Naval Command Complex, someone was running. The footsteps in the corridor stopped. Not gradually. They simply ceased, the way sound does when someone realizes they've been heard. For 3 seconds, nothing moved on either side of the sealed door. Then the handle turned and Colonel Victor Hale walked into Secure Conference 7 like a man arriving at a meeting he had scheduled himself. He was 54 years old, silver at the temples, a face that had learned over many years to perform confidence well enough that most people accepted it as the genuine article. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and wore the expression of someone who had been called back to the room for a routine matter, not someone who had been standing in the corridor outside a closed door listening to a dead woman speak. Maya watched him cross the threshold. She had known he was out there. She'd registered the sound of his footsteps slowing approximately 90 seconds before he stopped. Someone who had approached the door with intent, and then reconsidered, and then recalculated, and then decided that leaving would cost more than staying. That particular hesitation pattern had a specific texture she recognized from a long time ago in a different context from people making much higher stakes decisions in much worse conditions. Hale's eyes moved across the room and landed on her with a precision that told her everything she needed to know about how thoroughly he had prepared for this possibility. Not at all, and completely. "Colonel," Caldwell said. His voice carried the particular tone of a senior officer who has just discovered that the ground under a situation is softer than he thought and is now being very careful about where he puts his weight. "I wasn't aware you were in the building this morning." "I had an early meeting on 3, Hale said. He set his portfolio on the table near the door, not at a seat. A positioning choice, Maya noted, keeping his options open. "I heard there was an issue with access credentials." "News travels fast," Marsh said dryly. "Small building," Hale said. His gaze returned to Maya with the studied neutrality of someone trying not to look at the thing they most need to look at. "Is this the issue?" "This, well," Caldwell said, "is Master Sergeant Maya Whitmore, formerly Ghost Unit 7. Something crossed Hale's face so quickly that most people in the room would have missed it. Maya didn't miss it. She had spent months learning the vocabulary of his expressions from surveillance photographs and secondhand descriptions, and she recognized this one. It wasn't surprise. It was the expression of someone verifying a fact they already knew against the reality of the room. He had known she was here, or known she was somewhere close. He just hadn't known it was today. "Ghost Unit 7, he said. The inflection was calibrated, just enough gravity to seem appropriate, not so much that it looked performed. The Carrion Ridge unit. The one your operational timeline briefing helped destroy," Maya said. The room went quiet in a different way than it had before. Before, the silence had been the silence of confusion. This was the silence of people registering that something irreversible had just been said out loud. Hale looked at her without expression. "I'm not sure what you mean by that, Sergeant." "Master Sergeant," she said. "Shh, Master Sergeant." He inclined his head just slightly. A concession designed to look like courtesy. "I wasn't part of the operational briefing for Carrion Ridge." "You were in this room 3 days before the mission deployed," she said. "October 19th. The insertion window was discussed. The extraction corridors were mapped. The secondary holding position, which is the position my unit was occupying when the ambush began, Was on the slide deck. She looked at him steadily. You were in this room, Colonel. A lot of people are in a lot of rooms, Hale said. That's not evidence of anything. No, she agreed. It's not. She left it there. Hale looked at her for a moment longer, and then he looked at Caldwell, and the look carried a very specific request that Maya was also able to read without difficulty. Get this under control. Caldwell picked up the request and put it down again. There was a version of this situation, a version that existed 4 hours ago, in which he would have acted on it without thinking. That version was no longer available. He looked at Garrett, who was standing near the door with the expression of someone who had arrived expecting a routine credential check and was now in something considerably less routine. I need full building security on level 4. Nobody in or out of this corridor until I authorize it. Garrett nodded and stepped out again. Maya noted that he did not make eye contact with Hale on his way past. That was interesting. Rourke, who had been quiet for several minutes in the particular way of someone recalculating where they stood in a situation that had shifted significantly, said, Admiral, I think we need to suspend the briefing and move to a cleared review space. Whatever this is, Caldwell said, happened in this room. We're not moving it. He straightened in his chair and looked at Maya with a directness that she gave him credit for. Whatever his flaws, he wasn't the kind of man who looked away from things. Master Sergeant, you said there are things we need to discuss. Start. Maya opened the sealed evidence folder. Inside were 11 pages of material. She had not printed everything. Printing everything would have taken 40 pages in half a morning, and she was operating with a specific understanding of what this room needed to absorb first and what could wait. The 11 pages were the 11 most immediate items, the ones that addressed what had been said in this room in the last hour, the ones that would make it impossible for the people around this table to maintain the version of events they had been building for 11 months. She did not pass the pages around. She left them in front of her. The terrain analysis I referenced, she said, the 1150 versus 1400 meter firing position. That discrepancy appears in the original mission documentation. The post-incident report changed it. She looked up. The person who filed the post-incident report was Colonel Rourke. Rourke's face went very still. I didn't alter any... I'm not suggesting you altered the terrain data deliberately, Maya said. Her voice was measured. She was not accusing him of the things she was saving for Hale. I'm saying that the data you received before you filed the report had already been changed. Someone upstream of you gave you modified figures, and you filed them in good faith, and the result was a post-incident report that shifted the breach origin timeline by 3 hours and made field-level compromise the most logical conclusion. Rourke opened his mouth, closed it. She could see him running backward through his own memory, trying to locate the moment he had received the terrain figures who had handed them to him, whether he had questioned them or accepted them because the source was someone he trusted or outranked him, or both. Who gave you the corrected terrain file? Marsh asked him. Her voice was careful and specific. She was good at her job, Maya thought. She'd been watching Marsh for the past 90 minutes and had noted that she asked questions rather than making statements, that she was 3 beats ahead of most of the other officers in the room, and that she had not yet said anything she would need to walk back. Rourke looked at the table. He was doing the math in real time, and it was not adding up to anything comfortable. It came through operational review, he said slowly. Standard chain. The file was flagged as verified, and I... He stopped. Hale had moved, only slightly, shifted his weight, adjusted his hand on the portfolio, the kind of micro-movement that people make when they're managing the impulse to leave a room. Maya tracked it without looking directly at him. Colonel Rourke, she said, still looking at the pages in front of her. The flag on that file. The verification marker. Can you describe what it looked like? Rourke frowned. Standard DIA format. The issuing officer code. Was the issuing officer code a 6-digit number preceded by the letters VH? She asked. The room went quiet again. But this was a different quality of quiet than any of the previous ones. This was the quiet of people who had enough information to make a connection, but were waiting to see if they were right before they committed to having made it. Rourke looked at her. He did not answer immediately, which was an answer. VH, Marsh said softly. She looked at Hale. Hale said, "That's a coincidence of initials. You'd need to trace the full officer code through the system." "I've already traced it," Maya said. She turned to the third page in the evidence folder. She didn't pass it across the table. She turned it so that it faced outward and held it up long enough for the people closest to her to read the officer code at the top of the document. It wasn't a full accusation, it was a thread. But it was a thread she was holding up in front of a room full of people who now had enough context to see where it led. Hale's face had not changed. She watched him not change it, and she was impressed in the way you can be impressed by something that doesn't make it less dangerous. "I'd like to speak with the Admiral privately," Hale said. "No," Caldwell said. The single syllable was quiet and immediate, and it was the first thing Caldwell had said in the last 20 minutes that Maya had not anticipated. She had expected him to hedge, to want a private conversation, to want to manage this laterally, to do what senior officers often do when the situation is developing faster than their instinct for institutional protection can keep up with. Instead, he'd simply said no, and there was something in the way he said it that told her he was beginning to understand the shape of what he was sitting inside. She gave him a slight nod, which she suspected he didn't register, but she offered anyway. "You said you've already traced the officer code," Caldwell said to her. "What does that trace tell you?" "It links to a flagged terminal access event from 11 months ago," she said. 3 days after the post-incident report was filed, someone used an officer credential matching that code to access the classified mission archive for Carrion Ridge. The access lasted 6 minutes. 2 files were opened. One file contained the original terrain analysis, the unmodified version, with the 1150-meter figure intact. The other file contained the names and service records of all 8 personnel from Ghost Unit 7. She paused. "There's no operational reason to access both of those files together, 6 days after the mission was concluded and 3 days after the report was filed. There's only one reason someone would need that combination of documents at that moment. To verify that the cover story was holding," Marsh said. "Yes," Maya said. Hale said, "This is speculation." "The access log isn't speculation," she said. "It's a server record with a timestamp, an officer code, and an IP address that traces to a terminal in the Level 2 administrative wing of this building. That log has been sitting in the DIA system for 11 months. It was never flagged because nobody was looking for it." She looked at him. "I was looking for it." The room's silence had taken on a specific quality by now. The quality of something that has been falling for a long time and is approaching the ground. Hale looked back at her, and for the first time the performance of neutrality showed its seams. Not dramatically. He was too disciplined for that. But there was something behind his eyes that was making calculations that the rest of his face was trying not to reflect. "You've been building this case for 11 months, he said. "Undercover. In this building." "I've been building this case," she said, "for 11 months. "On whose authority?" "Special Assessment Office," she said. "You're welcome to pull that clearance order." "I will." "I know," she said. "It'll take you approximately 4 hours to get access to the right division, and when you do, you'll find that the authorization was signed at a level above this command." She paused. "I'd use those 4 hours differently." Something that might, in a different face, have been anger moved through Hale's expression. He controlled it. He was very good at controlling things. That was, she suspected, what had made him useful to the people he'd been doing business with for the last several years. Not his knowledge, not his access, but his control. His ability to sit in rooms full of people who trusted him and feel nothing that would show. "Admiral," Hale said, shifting his gaze to Caldwell with the movement of someone who has decided to change the terrain of the conversation. "This woman walked into a classified briefing under a clearance level that hasn't been verified through standard channels. She's presenting documents that haven't been authenticated by anyone in this room. None of this constitutes a formal investigation. It's one person with a personal grievance." "I wouldn't finish that sentence," Maya said. Not loud, not hard, just a statement of fact about the world. Hale stopped. 8 people died, she said. I was the 9th. They found me on a mountainside in Kunar province in November. hypothermic, with a through-and-through gunshot wound in my left shoulder and 3 broken ribs from the insertion, and I spent 6 weeks in a hospital in Germany being told by people I had never met that my team had been compromised by their own errors. She looked at him with a steadiness that had nothing theatrical about it. I have been very patient, Colonel. I would like you to understand that the patience is not unlimited. The room was absolutely still. Hale did not speak. Marsh looked down at the table. Rourke had both hands flat in front of him very carefully. Caldwell was looking at Maya with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet, something that had moved past recalculation and into the early stages of something that might become accountability, though that was a long road and she knew it. Parks, who had not said anything since identifying her unit tattoo, was looking at his hands. He'd been in Kandahar. He knew what it sounded like when someone described the physical residue of a firefight they hadn't been supposed to survive. It sounded like that. The door opened. Garrett stepped back in. He was moving slightly faster than he had before, and his expression had the particular quality of someone who has received information while out of the room and is managing the weight of it. "Admiral," he said, "I've completed the badge verification through the alternate DIA channel." He looked at Maya, then back at Caldwell. "Her clearance is valid. Special Assessment Office, Level 5, active mandate." He hesitated. "There's also a secondary flag on her file." "What kind of flag?" Caldwell asked. "A protection order," Garrett said, "issued by the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Any interference with her current operational mandate, including detention, credential revocation, or unauthorized access to her documentation, triggers an automatic notification to the Joint Chiefs Review Board." The room processed that. Hale's portfolio was still on the table near the door. He hadn't moved toward it. Maya noted this. She noted also that his left hand had tightened once, briefly, against the edge of the table, and then relaxed. "I need to make a phone call," he said. "You're welcome to make it from here," Caldwell said. "I'd prefer—" "I know what you'd prefer," Caldwell said. "You can make it here, or not at all." Hale looked at Caldwell for a long moment. The two men had a history. She didn't know the full shape of it, but she had enough pieces to know it was the kind of history built on mutual professional utility, the kind that corrodes quickly when the utility calculus changes. It was changing now. Visibly. Hale pulled out his phone and he looked at it for a moment. Then he set it face down on the table. And in the small act of putting the phone down without making the call, Maya saw something she had not entirely expected. Not relief, not capitulation, but something closer to exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just arrived, without quite meaning to, at the moment where they can no longer hold it up. She recognized that exhaustion. She had felt it herself in a different form, during 6 weeks in a hospital in Germany, when the weight of being the only one left had sat on her chest every morning she woke up. She did not feel sorry for him. She was precise about that with herself. But she recognized it, and recognition was useful. "Colonel Hale," she said. He looked at her. "I have 43 minutes of audio from this room," she said. "I have the access log. I have the modified terrain file, the original terrain file, and a digital forensic comparison of both that was prepared by a DIA analyst whose name is in the documentation." She laid each thing out quietly, without emphasis. "I have financial records. I have communication intercepts. Not mine. They were obtained through a lawful FISA application 12 weeks ago. I have testimony from 2 signals intelligence analysts who processed information during the Carrion Ridge mission window and noticed an anomaly they reported to their supervisor." She paused. "Their supervisor buried the report. That supervisor is also in the documentation." Hale's face was very still. "The case is built," she said. "I'm not here to build it. I've been here to present it, and to make sure that the people in this room, the people who conducted a briefing this morning that described my dead teammates as the architects of their own deaths, heard it directly." She looked at him without anger and without softness. All of it. Outside the door, somewhere on level 4, a second set of footsteps had joined the first. Then a third. The sound of purposeful movement in a corridor that had been quiet all morning. Maya did not look at the door. She kept her eyes on Hale. He had not spoken in 90 seconds, which was significant. Hale was a man who filled silences. She had read that in 3 separate character assessments compiled by people who had worked with him over the years. The word they all used was controlled, and what they meant by it was that he talked when silence became dangerous. He talked to redirect. He talked to recalibrate the room. He talked because words were the medium in which he operated, the substance of his particular kind of power. He wasn't talking now. The footsteps in the corridor had stopped just outside the door. Someone knocked. 3 times, deliberate. The specific cadence of federal authority announcing itself. Caldwell looked at Garrett. Garrett moved to the door and opened it. The man standing in the corridor was not in military uniform. He wore a dark suit with a visitor's badge that carried a classification color Maya recognized, and behind him were 2 more people, one in uniform, one not. And the woman at the back of the group was someone Maya had spoken to on a secure line 8 weeks ago in a hotel room in Reston, Virginia, when the final phase of the investigation had been authorized. Deputy Director Lena Farrow of the Defense Intelligence Agency looked at Maya across the threshold of Secure Conference 7. Then she looked at the room. Then she looked at Colonel Victor Hale, who was still standing near the door with his phone face down on the table and his portfolio under his arm. And her expression was the expression of someone arriving precisely where they intended to arrive. "Good morning," Farrow said. "I apologize for the interruption." Her voice was pleasant, unhurried, and carried the specific weight of someone who understood that every person in the room was now operating within a framework she controlled. "Colonel Hale, I'm going to need you to come with me." Hale did not move immediately. "Colonel?" she said again. Not louder, just more certain. And in the moment before he made his decision, in the half-second where she could see him considering all of his options and finding each of them unavailable, Hale looked at Maya one more time. She looked back at him. Whatever he was looking for in her face, she didn't give it to him. He picked up his phone. He picked up his portfolio. He walked toward the door with the measured, deliberate steps of a man who understood that the way he walked out of this room was the last form of control he had available to him. Farrow stepped aside. He passed her without speaking. The 2 people behind her fell into step on either side of him, and the 4 of them moved down the corridor and out of Maya's line of sight. She turned back to the room. Admiral Caldwell was looking at her with an expression she didn't have an easy word for. The authority was still there. It would always be there. It was too deeply structural to simply disappear because the morning had gone the way it had. But underneath it, or around it, there was something else she hadn't seen in him before this moment. He looked, she thought, like a man who was beginning to understand the size of the thing he had been inside without knowing it. "Master Sergeant Whitmore," he said. "Admiral." He looked at the sealed folder in front of her. At the 11 pages she had not yet finished presenting. At the recording device she had not yet confirmed out loud, though he knew it was there. She could see that he knew. "How long," he said, "has this investigation been active?" She told him. His jaw tightened once, and then he nodded. A small, precise movement that acknowledged something he wasn't quite ready to name yet. And outside Secure Conference 7, somewhere down the corridor of Level 4, Victor Hale's footsteps had stopped again. This time, they did not start back up. Maya waited. The corridor outside was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes after people have stopped pretending that ordinary procedure applies to the situation. Garrett had positioned himself near the door without being asked. Marsh had pulled out a legal pad, which told Maya she'd decided to document rather than manage, which was the smarter instinct. Rourke was looking at his hands with the expression of a man mentally retracing a route he'd traveled in good faith and finding the terrain was different than he remembered. Caldwell hadn't moved from his chair. He'd asked her how long the investigation had been active, and she'd told him 11 months, and he'd nodded, and now he was sitting with that number in whatever place a man puts things he can't immediately metabolize. 11 months. The entire length of the post-incident review, the entire length of the narrative that had been constructed around Carry-On Ridge, patiently and institutionally, while she had been moving through the building's lower floors in gray clothes with a thermal carafe and a recorder smaller than her thumbnail. "I want to understand something," Caldwell said finally. His voice had shed some of its command register. Not all of it, but enough that it sounded like a person rather than a rank. "The Special Assessment Office mandate. When was it issued?" 14 days after I was discharged from the military hospital in Landstuhl, she said. I was still on crutches. The left shoulder hadn't fully... She stopped. Not because it was painful to say, but because the detail wasn't relevant to what he needed to understand, and she had learned a long time ago to separate what was relevant from what was personal when both were true simultaneously. It was issued in December, 12 days before Christmas. By whom? The authorization signature is in the documentation, she said. You'll need to verify it through your own channels. I'm asking you. She looked at him. Assistant Secretary Harmon, Defense Intelligence Oversight Division. She paused. He lost a nephew at Carrion Ridge, Staff Sergeant Dale Harmon, 26 years old. I knew him. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. I knew all of them, she said, and she moved on before the weight of that could settle in the room and pull the conversation in a direction she didn't need it to go. Not yet. There would be time for that. There was a specific context in which those names needed to be spoken, and this wasn't it. This was still the operational layer, the evidentiary layer, the part where facts needed to be established before anything else could happen. She pulled her sleeve back. The tattoo on her inner left wrist was small. The stylized 7 inside its geometric border, done in black ink that had faded slightly at the edges after years of sun and field conditions. She'd gotten it in 2019, 3 months after the unit was formed, when 8 people who had been strangers decided they were something else. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Parks, who had identified it earlier, and who had been sitting in the particular stillness of someone carrying something he hadn't asked to pick up. You were in Kandahar in 2020, she said. Parks looked at her carefully. 2 tour, yes. Ghost Unit 7 ran an overwatch operation out of FOB Tanner in April of that year, she said. You were on base during the debrief. He thought about it, then slowly, I remember the debriefs, I wasn't in the room. No, she said, but you saw the unit in the common area afterward. You said something to our team lead, Sergeant First Class Dominic Reyes. She said the name cleanly. The way you say a name when you've made peace with the fact that saying it is going to hurt, but you've decided that not saying it would cost more. You said his team looked like they'd aged 5 years in 4 hours. Parks went very still. He told me that, she said. Later. He thought it was funny. Something crossed Parks's face. Not quite grief, not quite recognition. The expression of a person unexpectedly handed a small human piece of someone who no longer existed. I remember him, Parks said. Reyes. Yes, she said. The room let that sit for 1 second. Then she opened the evidence folder to page 4. Deputy Director Farrow will be conducting the formal interrogation with Colonel Hale in the Level 2 secure interview suite, she said, returning to the operational layer. That process will take several hours. In the meantime, there are things this room needs to address before the formal investigation closes around the command structure. She looked at Caldwell. Specifically, the briefing conducted this morning. Caldwell's expression sharpened. What about it? The characterization of the Carrion Ridge breach as field level in origin, she said. That characterization appeared in official briefing materials distributed to 14 personnel this morning. Before the investigation is concluded and before any information restriction can be placed on this session, those 14 people carry that characterization in their active knowledge base. It needs to be formally corrected in this room, in this session, before anyone leaves. Rourke looked up from his hands. That's a procedural request. It's a formal request made under the SAO mandate, she said. It's in the documentation. Marsh was writing. She hadn't stopped writing since the door had closed. Caldwell looked at Rourke. The look was long and carried a complicated history. The history of 2 men who had worked within the same institutional framework for long enough that they had developed a kind of professional shorthand, and who were now discovering that the shorthand had been built, in part, on information that wasn't accurate. The field-level breach characterization, Caldwell said to Rourke, was it in the original brief or the revised? The revised, Rourke said, and he said it with the flat precision of someone who has decided that the only useful thing he can do at this point is be accurate. Revised by whom? Rourke looked at the table. The file came through Colonel Hale's office. The room absorbed that in silence. Caldwell turned back to Maya. What do you need from us for the formal record? A verbal acknowledgement from the presiding officer. You, that the field-level breach characterization presented this morning was unverified and has been superseded by evidence currently under SAO review. That acknowledgement gets logged to the session record and will be attached to the investigation documentation. And the session recording? The SAO recorder has been running since 6/14, she said. It will be submitted as part of the formal evidence package. Caldwell's jaw tightened once, not in anger, in the specific way jaws tighten when a person is absorbing the full scope of what has been true about their morning without their knowledge. He had run this briefing. He had ordered her out of the room. Every word he had said since 6/14, including the words he'd said before he knew who she was on record. He was smart enough to understand that how he handled the next few minutes mattered more than anything that had already happened. For the record, he said clearly and carefully, the breach origin characterization presented in today's session was derived from a modified post-incident report that is currently under formal DIA review. That characterization is not confirmed and should not be treated as established fact by any personnel in this room. He looked around the table. Is that understood? It wasn't a question, a series of nods. Marsh wrote without looking up. Good, Maya said. She was reaching for the folder to move to the next page when the door opened again and Pharaoh stepped back in, alone. Without the two people who had been with her when she'd collected Hale from the corridor. She moved to the wall near the door and stood without sitting, a positioning choice that said she was here to observe, not to take over the room. She looked at Maya and gave her a small nod that carried a lot of information. Maya looked back. The nod meant Hale was talking. Not fully. Not yet, but he had started, which was the first structural crack in a position that had been very carefully maintained for 11 months. It meant the next phase was active. It also meant they were running on a compressed timeline. Deputy Director, Caldwell said. Admiral, Pharaoh said. Please continue. Maya turned to page 5. She had prepared the evidence package in the order that would be most productive for this specific room with this specific audience, not the order that would be most damaging. The order that would be most comprehensible. There was a difference, and she had spent considerable time on it during the hotel room nights in Reston and Fairgate, and the 2 weeks she'd spent in a borrowed apartment in Arlington going through documents that had arrived through channels she couldn't name in this room. Page 5 was the signals intelligence anomaly. She laid it out in specific terms. The two analysts, the communication pattern they'd identified during the Carrion Ridge mission window, the report they'd filed, and the supervisor who had buried it. She named the supervisor, Captain Ellis Dowd, currently assigned to the Pacific Fleet Signals Division, and she explained the burial mechanism, which was not a deletion but a reclassification. The file moved to a category that made it effectively invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it in that exact location. Someone had known which drawer to put it in. How did you find the reclassified file? Marsh asked. She was still writing, but she was also tracking. One of the analysts who filed the original report, Maya said. She kept a personal copy, not on a government system. She paused. She was 17 days from the end of her service contract when she contacted the SAO. She didn't want to leave and have the file disappear entirely. What's her name? Caldwell asked. She's a protected witness in the formal investigation, Maya said. Her name is in the sealed annex. Rourke said, and Dowd? Captain Dowd has been on administrative hold for 6 weeks, Pharaoh said from the wall, and the room turned toward her. Pending investigation. He's aware. He's been cooperating at a limited level. She paused. His cooperation increased this morning when he was informed that Colonel Hale was in custody. Rourke put both hands flat on the table and said nothing. The room had reached a specific threshold. The threshold past which the shape of the betrayal was no longer a theory or an implication, but a structure, a thing with dimensions. 8 dead, 1 survivor, a modified terrain file, a buried signals report, a reclassification move by someone who knew exactly where to hide a document, an officer code traced to a terminal in the Level 2 administrative wing, and at the center of it, a set of gambling debts that Maya had found in a financial forensic report buried deep in the documentation. Not on page 5, not yet, but coming. She would get to the money. She always got to the money. The money was always where the human part lived, under all the tactical and procedural layers. The part that was not a traitor or a colonel or a security breach, but a person who had made a series of choices under pressure and kept making them until the choices had a body count. She turned to page 6. She heard someone in the room inhale. Page 6 was a photograph, not a crime scene photograph, not a surveillance photograph, a photograph from a memorial service, taken by a family member and submitted to the investigation through a civilian channel. 8 framed photographs on a folding table outside a chapel in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. 8 faces, flowers that someone had cut and arranged that morning, the stems still wet. She had put it in the package because this room needed to see it, not to manipulate, to locate, to establish, before the next layer of evidence arrived, what the evidence was about. The room looked at it. Nobody spoke for a full 30 seconds. She gave them the 30 seconds. Sergeant First Class Dominic Reyes, she said, 34, from Albuquerque. He coached youth soccer in the off-seasons. Staff Sergeant Dale Harmon, 26, just passed his advanced marksmanship qualification the month before deployment. Corporal Jasmine Tran, 22, the youngest. She could strip and reassemble a carbine in under 40 seconds. She went through all 8. She had memorized their details, not for this room, but because forgetting felt like a second loss she couldn't afford. In this room, the memorization happened to be useful. Technical Sergeant Roy Calloway, 41. He had a retirement date. He was going back to New Mexico and building a fence around his property, which he'd been meaning to do for 6 years. The room was very quiet. Caldwell was looking at the photograph. He had the expression of a man being asked to convert something he had processed administratively into something he had to carry differently. Pharaoh, near the door, had her eyes on Maya. "This is what was lost," Maya said. "These are the people who were described in this room this morning as having compromised their own mission. I want that on the record too." "It is," Marsh said, not looking up from her pad. Maya nodded. She closed page 6 over page 5 and moved forward. The next section was where the timeline collapsed inward, where the various threads she had laid out in the previous pages converged into a single narrative that was very difficult to look at and equally difficult to dispute. Hale's financial records were on page 7. She had obtained them through the FISA application, and the FISA application was documented in the sealed annex, and every step of the chain was clean and specific because she had understood from the beginning that the case would live or die on procedure, not on what she knew was true. She knew what was true. She had known for 8 months, but knowing and being able to prove in a way that holds were different things, and she had been patient about the difference. The record showed a pattern beginning approximately 22 months ago. Debts accumulating through private channels, not public gambling establishments, which would have appeared in standard background review, but private arrangements of the kind that people with certain social access fall into and find difficult to exit. The debt had grown. The debt had been noticed by people who notice those things and consider them opportunities. 18 months ago, the first payment, not to Hale directly, through a structure of 3 financial entities, each in a different jurisdiction, each with a legitimate surface function. The forensic accountant's report in the annex had traced it across 14 months of work and 47 discrete transactions. The total paid to Hale through those channels, across a period of approximately 16 months ending 3 weeks before the Carry-on Ridge deployment, was $212,000. She stated the number clearly and without emphasis. The room absorbed it. "That's not," Rourke started. "It's in the forensic report," she said. "The methodology is detailed in the annex. Every transaction is traced to source." Marsh had stopped writing. She was looking at the page 7 figure. Caldwell said quietly, "Victor Hale has been an officer for 22 years. "Yes," Maya said. "He's been in this building for 11 of them." "I know," she said. There was something in the way Caldwell said it. Not defending Hale, not excusing him, but absorbing the fact that someone can be known for a long time and be doing something entirely different from what they appear to be doing. The specific grief of institutional betrayal, which is not the same as personal betrayal, but is not entirely separate from it either. She understood that grief. She had her own version of it, not for Hale, but for the version of the command structure she had believed in before Carrion Ridge, before she had read her own file and found the phrase status ongoing medical review and understood what it was covering. 2 people in the foreign signals chain have been identified, she said, moving forward. Both have diplomatic status in their respective postings, which complicates prosecution. That's addressed in a separate track of the investigation that I'm not the lead on. She paused. My mandate was the domestic chain, the breach point inside this command structure. Hale, Caldwell said. Hale. And the secondary actors who processed or suppressed information that enabled the cover story to hold, she said. Some of them did it knowingly. Some did it because they were given information by someone they trusted and didn't question it. She looked at Rourke. He looked back at her. His face had the particular quality of a man doing a very specific kind of accounting, not trying to minimize his role, but trying to understand it accurately. She had studied him too. He was not Hale. He was something else, a person who had been a convenient instrument because of his position and his procedural compliance and his habit of trusting the information that came down the chain above him. You're going to want a lawyer, she said to him, not unkindly. Not because your exposure is the same as Hale's. It isn't. But because this process is going to ask you very specific questions about what you knew and when, and you should have someone with you when it does. Rourke nodded, once, slowly. Farrow stepped away from the wall. Admiral, I need to borrow the room for the next phase of the process. Your personnel can wait in the Level 4 briefing annex. There's a room designated. Captain Marsh, I'll need you to provide your documentation to my team before you leave this space. Marsh nodded without protest. She had been noting and recording all morning, and now she handed what she'd been building to the person who would carry it forward. There was something straightforward about that. A person who understood her function and performed it without needing it to be more complicated than it was. The room began to move. Chairs pushed back. The junior colonels and aides began collecting folders and devices with the uncertain efficiency of people who had come in for a routine, classified briefing and were leaving as witnesses to something considerably more significant. Parks paused near Maya's chair on his way to the door. He looked at her for a moment. Reyes, he said. What he said to me after that debrief in Kandahar, about looking like we'd aged 5 years. He paused. I remember it. I didn't think he noticed. He noticed everything, she said. Parks held her gaze for another second. Then he nodded and walked out. The room emptied in stages until it was Farrow, Maya, and Caldwell. Caldwell had not stood up. He was still in his chair at the head of the table, and the folder of evidence pages was in front of him, and he was looking at the photograph on page 6 with the particular attention of a man who has run out of ways to manage his distance from something. He came to the post-incident review meeting, Caldwell said. Hale. He sat in this room. He helped draft the field-level breach language. He stopped. I signed the final report. I know, Maya said. I signed it based on the information I had. I know that too, she said. He looked at her. I'm not asking you to. He stopped again. Whatever he was going to say, he decided it wasn't the right sentence. I told you to leave this room this morning. Yes. Because I thought you didn't belong here. Yes. He looked at the photograph again. 8 faces on a folding table, flowers with wet stems. I was wrong, he said. She didn't say anything. It wasn't false modesty. It was precision. He was right that he was wrong, and saying yes you were, or it's fine, or any other response was going to add weight to a moment that didn't need it. Some things just needed to be said and acknowledged and left where they landed. Farrow moved to the table and began organizing the evidence pages carefully, placing them back in the folder in the order Maya had arranged them. She did this with the attention of someone who understood that the order mattered for what came next. He's talking, Farrow said. She kept her eyes on the pages. Hale. He asked for an attorney 20 minutes ago. The attorney is en route, but in the window between the room and the attorney he said something. Maya looked at her. He said he wants to speak to you directly, Farrow said. Before the formal process begins. He said, she paused, and the pause was not dramatic, but it was real. The pause of someone conveying information that has a specific weight. He said there's something you don't have yet, something that wasn't in the financial records or the communication intercepts, something that changes the scope of the operation. The room was very quiet. Maya looked at the closed door. Somewhere below her, on level 2, Victor Hale was sitting in a secure interview room with the phone he'd been carrying all morning, and whatever it was he'd decided in the last 20 minutes was more valuable as a trade than as a secret. What did he say specifically? She asked. He said, Farrow looked up from the folder. Her face was careful. He said the Carrion Ridge mission wasn't the first. He said there was a previous operation. 14 months before Carrion Ridge. A different unit, different insertion zone, different outcome, but the same information channel, the same foreign intermediary. She paused. He said 8 soldiers died at Carrion Ridge. At the earlier operation, she stopped. Maya looked at her steadily. He said 11, Farrow said. And the number landed in the room like something dropped from a height, and Maya felt the floor of what she had believed she understood about the scope of this, the floor she had built over 11 months from evidence and procedure and patience, shift under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the building she was standing in. 19, not 8, 19 soldiers. And somewhere in the DIA system, in a folder reclassified to a location designed to be invisible, there was a report that nobody had been looking for because nobody knew it existed. Until now. 19. Maya stood with that number for exactly 4 seconds. She knew it was 4 seconds because she counted, an old habit from field operations, when the space between receiving information and acting on it needed to be deliberate rather than reactive, because reactive in those situations got people killed. Then she picked up the evidence folder. I need to see him, she said. Farrow was already moving toward the door. The attorney arrives in 40 minutes. After that, everything goes through formal channels and the window closes. I understand. Maya. Farrow used her first name, which she had done exactly once before, in the hotel room in Reston when the mandate was authorized, and Farrow had looked at her across a table covered in documents and said, with the directness of someone who respects the person they're talking to enough not to soften things, this is going to take everything you have, and it still might not be enough. She used it the same way now, not warmly, not as a gesture of comfort, but as a signal that what she was about to say was being said person to person rather than rank to rank. The previous operation. If what he's claiming is accurate, 11 additional casualties from a separate event, same channel, same foreign intermediary. That's not a contained breach. That's a systematic program. I know what it is, Maya said. It changes your mandate. What you were authorized to investigate was Carrion Ridge. A systematic program of this scope goes above the SAO. It goes above DIA. It becomes a joint investigation with NSA. NSA involvement. Possibly congressional notification. I know all of that, Maya said. But right now, in the next 38 minutes, it's still mine. And I need to hear it from him directly. Farrow held her gaze for a moment. Then she stepped aside from the door and opened it. Caldwell was still at the table. He hadn't moved during the exchange, and Maya had been aware of him in the peripheral way you are aware of a significant presence in a small space, not watching him, but tracking him. As she moved toward the door, he said, Master Sergeant? She stopped. When this is over, he said. He didn't finish the sentence immediately. He was choosing words with the care of someone who had used words imprecisely for the last several hours and was now aware of the cost of imprecision. I want to understand what I missed, not for the investigation, for myself. She looked at him across the room. The Admiral with his immaculate uniform and his 61 years of institutional authority, sitting at the head of a table in a room where everything had come apart in the space of a morning. You missed it because someone you trusted gave you a clean version, she said. That's not absolution, but it's accurate. She walked out. The Level 2 secure interview suite was reached through a corridor that connected to a stairwell that connected to another corridor, and Maya walked it with Farrow 2 steps behind her. The building felt different than it had at 6:14 that morning. Not physically different, but atmospherically, the way a place feels when the thing that has been happening inside it is no longer hidden. Two of Pharaoh's personnel were stationed at the stairwell entrance. 3 more were near the interview suite door. The building's security from level 4 had been consolidated and repositioned, and the personnel movements visible through the corridor's security glass had the specific quality of a facility that has shifted from routine operation to active federal procedure. Maya noted all of it and kept moving. The interview suite had a window, not a two-way mirror. Those were in a different configuration of room. This was a narrow observation window with a privacy blind that was currently halfway open, and through it she could see Victor Hale seated at the interview table in the position that people adopt when they've decided to stay in the room but haven't decided how much of themselves to give it. He was sitting with his hands visible on the table, a glass of water in front of him, half empty. His portfolio was gone, confiscated at the door, she assumed. Without it, he looked marginally smaller, the way people do when you remove the props they've used to establish their presence in a room. He was looking at the wall. Maya watched him for a moment through the observation window. She was assessing the physical language. Not for deception, she was past the point where that was the primary question, but for condition. How much energy he had. Whether he was in the early stages of physiological stress response, or whether he had stabilized into something more manageable. The glass of water was informative. He'd drunk half of it, which meant he was hydrating deliberately, which meant he was managing himself rather than operating on pure adrenaline, which meant he had more cognitive control than she might have preferred. He was going to be careful in there. She went in. He heard the door and turned before she was fully through it, which told her his stress response was running higher than the water glass suggested. His body was tracking sounds with the alertness of someone who is waiting for the specific thing they're afraid of. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, he'd known she was coming, but a kind of settling. The specific way a person looks when the thing they've been dreading arrives and turns out to have a face they can see. She sat across from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You came in here this morning with a service cart," he said. "Yes." "I walked past you twice in the corridor." He said it without inflection. "I didn't look at you." "No." He looked at his hands. "How long have you known it was me specifically, not the command structure broadly, me?" She thought about whether to answer that. It wasn't a procedural question. There was no process benefit or harm to telling him. It was a human question, the kind that gets asked in rooms like this because the person asking needs to understand the shape of what happened to them. 7 months, she said. He absorbed that. 7 months of her walking through corridors, pouring coffee, sitting in rooms he was sometimes in, while carrying the specific knowledge of what he had done. She could see him trying to reconstruct the timeline. Which interactions, which moments, which of the times he'd been in this building in the last 7 months had involved her presence in some form. "The access log," he said, "the terminal on level 2. "That was month 3, she said. "It put your office code at the archive." "But an office code alone isn't sufficient. It could have been someone using your credentials without your knowledge." "What made it specifically me?" "The gambling debt forensics," she said, "and a phone record. A contact in Cyprus that appears in your communication history 11 times over 14 months. The contact's number is registered to a financial entity that traces through 4 intermediate steps to a foreign intelligence adjacent organization." She paused. "The FISA application was based on that chain." He nodded, slowly, like someone confirming a map of a place they've been. "The attorney's coming," he said. "I know. After that, I can't talk to you without counsel present." He said it not as a threat or a negotiation, but as a statement of fact, the legal reality of the situation, acknowledged plainly. "I know that too," she said. "So I have about 35 minutes. 34, she said. He looked at her steadily. The performance of neutrality was gone. She'd watched it leave his face between the level 4 corridor in this room, stripped away by the accumulated weight of the morning. What was left was something more difficult to categorize. Not remorse, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a person who has arrived, after a long journey through choices they told themselves were manageable, at the specific point where the accounting can no longer be deferred. "I need something," he said. You said you had information. I do. And I need something in exchange. He watched her face. Not immunity. I don't have an illusion about what I'm looking at. I know what espionage carries. I know what the charge sheet is going to look like. He paused. I want the gambling debt structure disclosed as context in the sentencing documentation, not as excuse, as record. I want it on record that there were people who identified what I owed and used it deliberately, that the initial contact was made to me, not by me. Maya looked at him. That's a request for your attorney to make through formal channels. I know, but I want to hear from you that it's going to be part of the record. It already is, she said. The financial forensics are in the documentation. The contact initiation sequence is traced. It's in the package. Something shifted in his face. Not relief. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who has been carrying a specific weight long enough that discovering someone else has already documented it is not entirely unwelcome. Tell me about the previous operation, she said. He looked at the table. He was organizing what he was going to say. She could see the process, the internal sequencing of a man who had spent 22 years in a profession that valued the careful arrangement of information before its release. Operation Darkfall, he said. 14 months before Carrion Ridge. 3-unit insertion into Helmand Province. The operation was classified above my normal access level. I shouldn't have known the insertion coordinates or the extraction window. He stopped. I knew them because I was given them, by the same contact, the same Cyprus number. He looked up. I wasn't asked to do anything with them that first time. It was framed as a test, proof of access, proof that the information I could provide was reliable. Maya kept her expression level. A test. The first transaction in a systematic grooming process. Provide information at no apparent cost. Establish the value of the access. Then leverage the act of having provided it when the stakes increase. 11 soldiers, she said. 11, he said. I didn't know it at the time. The operation's outcome was classified. I only knew there had been casualties when I heard it through the building's informal channels, and by then the connection to my information wasn't something I allowed myself to make explicitly. His voice was flat and honest in the way of someone who has stopped the work of self-protection and is now just describing what happened. I allowed myself to not know. That's the accurate way to put it. Who on this installation knew about Darkfall's outcome? The full casualty count, maybe 6 people. He paused. Hale. That's me. I keep doing that. He caught himself, and for a second something human and almost fragile moved through his expression, the dissonance of referring to himself in the third person and then colliding with the first. I knew. The previous chief of operations, General Warren, retired now, been out of the building for 9 months. Caldwell had a partial briefing, but not the full numbers. The others I'm not certain about. Warren. Maya filed the name. It wasn't in her current documentation. If Warren had a partial briefing on Darkfall's outcome and had left the building 9 months ago, there was a separate thread there that would need tracing. The contact in Cyprus, she said. Did you have a name? An identifier. Not a real name. I wasn't naive enough to believe I was getting a real name. He reached for the water glass and drank the remaining half without looking away from her. The identifier was Meridian. Maya wrote nothing down. She was recording. A second device, smaller than the one she'd used upstairs, clipped inside the collar of her jacket. She had informed Pharaoh of its presence before entering the room. Meridian, she said. It was a handler name. There was a chain. Meridian was the contact layer. Above Meridian, there would have been a control structure I never had access to. That's standard. He set the glass down. What I can give you is the full communication record, not just what your FISA intercepts caught. I kept my own record. The room was very quiet. You kept records, she said. Not on any government system, he said. Encrypted. Local device, not networked. I kept it because... He stopped. He was trying to find the honest version of why, and she could see it wasn't a simple reason. Because at a certain point, the weight of it was too much to carry without having some kind of... He shook his head. I don't have a word for it that doesn't sound like I'm trying to frame it as something other than what it was. Where is the device? Safe deposit box. Personal. Not connected to any military facility. The key is in my apartment, taped to the back of a desk drawer. He said the location precisely, the way you say an address you've memorized against the moment you'd need to give it. The box is at a Fairgate branch bank. Box number 441. I'll need that in a formal statement. I know, I'm telling you now so that... He stopped again. He was doing it again, trying to find the honest version. So that you have it, before the attorney, before the formal process. You, specifically. She looked at him. Because you were the one who came into this room, she said. Because those were your people, he said. The sentence landed in the space between them and stayed there. She didn't respond to it immediately. Not because it didn't land. It landed squarely, in the specific place she'd been protecting for 11 months. But because the way it landed wasn't something she wanted to respond to in a way she hadn't chosen. After a moment, she said, I'm going to need you to go through the full Darkfall communication sequence with a formal investigator. Every contact date, every piece of information transferred, every response from Meridian, the complete chain. Yes. The Darkfall casualties, do you have their names? He hesitated. I had access to a list once. I didn't... He stopped. I didn't keep it. That's all right, she said. We'll find them. She stood up. He looked up at her. The 22-year officer, the 54-year-old man with silver at his temples who had sat in rooms with people he was betraying and performed normalcy with sufficient skill that it had taken 11 months and a dead woman who wasn't dead to find the seams. There's one more thing, he said. She was halfway to the door. Meridian, he said. The last communication I had, 3 weeks before Carrion Ridge. Meridian told me it was the last operation, that after Carrion Ridge the channel would go dark, that I would have fulfilled the debt. He paused. But 2 weeks ago I received a message, same identifier, different device origin. Maya turned around slowly. What did it say? She said. It said, the investigation has been noted. The asset remains useful. Stand by. She looked at him. 2 weeks ago. While she was in the final phase of evidence preparation, while the SAO mandate was moving toward authorization for the formal operation, while she had been careful and precise and patient, someone on the other side had been watching the investigation develop. Did you respond? She said. No. Did you report it? No. He held her gaze. I'm reporting it now. She crossed back to the table and leaned forward with both hands flat on the surface. Who else knew about this investigation, outside of the SAO and DIA oversight? I don't know. That's not good enough. I know it isn't. His voice was level. I don't have an answer for you. I don't know who Meridian's control structure reports to. I don't know how they got visibility on an SAO investigation. I just know that 2 weeks ago they did. She straightened. She was thinking fast in the specific way she'd been trained. Not in a line, but in a network, pulling threads simultaneously, testing the weight of each one. Meridian knew about the investigation, which meant either the investigation had been surveilled externally or there was a source inside the investigation's awareness circle. The circle was small. Farrow, Harmon, 2 DIA analysts, the witness analyst who'd kept her copy, and the forensic accountant, and Maya herself. Or someone who had seen one of the documents, one of the authorization trails, one of the administrative channels through which a Level 5 mandate moved. She walked to the door and opened it. Farrow was in the corridor. 2 weeks ago, Hale received a contact from the Cypress-linked identifier, Maya said, low and direct. Message indicating the handler has visibility on the investigation. Farrow's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. He's certain of the identifier? He says so. I believe him. He's past the point where fabrication serves him. Maya looked at Farrow steadily. We need to review the authorization chain, the mandate paperwork, every access point between Harmon's office and the operational filing. That's a counterintelligence sweep of our own process, Farrow said. I know what it is, Maya said. Farrow was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, I'll make the call. Maya stepped back into the corridor fully and let the interview suite door close behind her. Through the observation window, she could see Hale at the table, looking at his hands. He had the bearing of someone who has set down the last thing he was carrying and is now simply waiting for whatever comes next. Farrow was already on a secure line at the far end of the corridor, her voice low and efficient, her body angled toward the wall with the posture of someone relaying information that can't afford to be heard by the wrong ears. One of her personnel had moved to block the corridor entrance. Another had positioned himself near the stairwell. Maya stood outside the interview suite door and breathed. She was running the authorization chain in her head, mapping every person who had touched the SAO mandate documentation from the moment it was signed in December to the moment she had walked through the Fairgate complex entrance at 6:14 that morning. She was looking for the point, not dramatically, not with urgency she couldn't control, but methodically, the way she'd been trained to clear a structure. Room by room, corner by corner. The mandate had been signed by Assistant Secretary Harmon, filed through DIA oversight, processed by a clearance administrator whose name she knew, logged in a system with limited access nodes. The operational file, the actual case documentation, the evidence package, had been kept on a standalone encrypted drive that she physically controlled at all times. She had not filed interim reports through any networked system. She had communicated through secure lines, not encrypted email, specifically to reduce the digital surface area. So either Meridian's visibility came from the authorization paperwork, the mandate, the clearance log, the DIA administrative trail, or it came from a human source. Someone who had heard something, seen something, or been told something they then passed along. She thought about the clearance administrator. She had a name and a function and had considered him background, one of many administrative nodes through which the mandate had passed. She had not investigated him because investigating the clearance administrator of your own mandate was the kind of thing you had to have a specific reason for. She had a reason now. She looked at Farrow, still on the phone. The attorney for Hale would arrive in approximately 20 minutes. After that, the formal process would absorb him and the next piece of information she needed. The full Darkfall communication sequence, the safe deposit box, the scope of what Meridian knew, would move into official channels and she would be one participant among several. That was correct. That was how it was supposed to work. She just needed to make sure that the 20 minutes between now and the attorney's arrival were used precisely. She went back into the interview suite. Hale looked up. "The clearance administrator who processed the SAO mandate," she said. "Name, Drew Kessler. Level 3 Administrative DIA Overhead Division. You know him?" Hale thought about it. The name recognition process was visible on his face. Not immediate, not fabricated, genuinely working through a mental contact list the way someone does when given a name they may have encountered without specifically cataloging. "Kessler," he said. "I know the name. Not personally." He paused. "He processed a separate clearance application for my office about 18 months ago. Standard. I signed a form, he processed it. I don't think I ever met him in person." 18 months ago, she said. Hale looked at her. The calculation was happening behind his eyes. 18 months ago was approximately the midpoint of the period during which he had been in contact with Meridian. A clearance application processed during that window by an administrator who had later processed the SAO mandate that was investigating him. "That could be coincidence," he said. "It could," she said. She left the room again. Farrow had finished her call. She was looking at Maya with an expression that had moved from controlled to something slightly more angular. "I ran Kessler's access log," she said. "Level 3 administrator, as you said. His access log for the SAO mandate file shows 2 entries, the original processing date in December, and 1 additional access." She paused. 4 days after the initial filing, a reaccess to the file that lasted 11 minutes and was logged at 0740 on a Wednesday morning. "What happens in 11 minutes with a mandate file?" Maya asked. "You can read it," Farrow said. "You can read it, and you can take notes, and you can make 1 copy through the system before the file audit would flag a second copy attempt. And then you could carry those notes out of the building in your head or on paper." "Where's Kessler now?" Farrow looked at her. "He applied for personal leave 2 weeks ago, 3 days after Hale received the contact from Meridian." Her voice was very flat. He's been on leave for 11 days. His supervisor logged the request as standard, no cause for flag. He was due back tomorrow. Maya said, "Has anyone made contact with him?" "My person is calling his home number now," Pharaoh said, "and his cell." They stood in the corridor for 45 seconds, which was how long it took for Pharaoh's personnel at the far end of the hallway to lower his phone and turn toward them with the specific expression of someone who has made a call and received an outcome he didn't expect. He walked toward them. "No answer on either line," he said. "I ran his residential address through the building's emergency contact system." Neighbor response. She was listed as emergency contact. He paused. "The neighbor says Kessler left 11 days ago, said he was visiting family, but he left in a hurry. She found his cat outside his apartment door. He hadn't made arrangements for the cat." The corridor was quiet. Maya looked at the floor for a moment. The clean institutional linoleum of a federal building that had been, for the last several hours, the location of a controlled investigation unfolding in a controlled manner, and which was now in the space of 4 minutes, revealing a dimension that was considerably less controlled than she had understood. A clearance administrator with access to the SAO mandate. A foreign intelligence handler who had known about the investigation for at least 2 weeks. A man who had left his cat outside his apartment door and disappeared into the gap between leave application and return date. The Darkfall operation. 11 dead. A systematic program that had been running for longer than she had known. She looked at Pharaoh. "I need access to Kessler's full personnel file," she said. "Financial background, not the standard version. The deep forensic version, same parameters as Hale. And I need the building's entry log cross-referenced with the Cyprus communication intercepts. Every date Hale had contact with the Meridian identifier, I need to know if Kessler was in this building." "That's going to take—" "I know how long it takes," Maya said. "Start it." Pharaoh turned to her personnel and issued 3 rapid instructions, and the personnel moved with the efficiency of people who have been waiting for specific direction and are now executing it. The corridor became briefly purposeful. Phones, movement, the specific energy of a federal investigation accelerating. Maya stood still in the middle of it. 19 soldiers, 2 operations, a handler who knew the investigation existed, an administrator who had left his apartment 11 days ago and hadn't been heard from since. And somewhere, in a safe deposit box in a branch bank 3 miles from this building, an encrypted device that held the full communication record between Victor Hale and Meridian. Every date, every data transfer, every instruction, and whatever else Hale had documented in the accumulated weight of what he'd been carrying. Box 441. She turned to Pharaoh's remaining personnel and said, "I need a warrant for a safe deposit box. Authorization through the SAO mandate, Fairgate Branch Bank, Box 441. I need it executed before 1800 hours today." The personnel looked at Pharaoh. Pharaoh nodded. "Go," she said. He went. The investigation had changed shape in the space of 40 minutes, the way terrain changes when you crest a ridge and discover the valley below is larger and more complex than the map suggested. She had come into the Fairgate complex this morning to present evidence about Carrion Ridge. She was leaving it, or would be eventually, with the beginning of something larger, something with 2 confirmed operations and a death count of 19 and a foreign handler who was still active, and a missing administrator and an encrypted device in a box she didn't yet have access to. It was not the clean conclusion she had planned, but she had learned, on a mountainside in Kunar province in November with a bullet in her shoulder and 3 broken ribs and 8 teammates who were no longer breathing, that clean conclusions were not the kind of thing the world offered reliably, and that the work of survival and accountability was not a narrative that resolved neatly, but a thing you kept doing as long as you were able. She was still able. Pharaoh was beside her. "The attorney is 12 minutes out." "I know." "After that, Hale is in formal process. You're going to be asked to step back from direct contact." "I know," she said again. "The Kessler thread, the Meridian contact, the Darkfall scope expansion, that gets folded into a joint investigation. It doesn't stay SAO." "I know that," she said. "It should be joint. It's bigger than one office." Pharaoh looked at her. "You're all right with that." "I'm not all right with any of it," she said precisely. "But I understand the structure." She paused. 19 soldiers, Lena. Whatever happens with the investigation structure, I need those 11 names from Darkfall. I need to know who they were. We'll find them, Pharaoh said. Don't tell me we'll find them, Maya said. Not sharply, just directly. Tell me it's a priority. Tell me their families are going to be contacted. Tell me they're not going to stay as a footnote in a classified case file for another year while the structural investigation takes precedence. Pharaoh held her gaze. I'll make it a named priority in the Joint Investigation Authorization, she said. The 11, by name, with family notification before the first joint session. Maya nodded. She looked at the observation window. Hale was still at the table, his posture different now, not collapsed, not defeated in a theatrical sense, but settled into something less armored than the man who had walked through the door of Secure Conference 7 that morning with his leather portfolio and his practiced neutrality. The key to Box 441 was taped to the back of a desk drawer in an apartment 3 miles from this building. The warrant was in process. Pharaoh's personnel were running the entry log cross-reference. The attorney was 11 minutes out, and in the Level 4 secure communications room, which Maya had not yet been inside but which she would be in before the end of the day, the building's encrypted recording system had captured everything that had happened in Secure Conference 7 from 6:14 that morning, every word, every silence, every moment in which the men in that room had discussed the deaths of her teammates as an administrative matter, and a woman in a gray service uniform had listened to every word. It was a long day. It was going to be a longer evening. But when Pharaoh's phone buzzed and she looked at it, and her expression changed in the specific way of someone receiving information that reorders the priority sequence of everything else, Maya turned to look at her, and what she saw in Pharaoh's face was the expression of someone who has just discovered that the investigation they thought they were closing had a door they hadn't opened yet. What? Maya said. Pharaoh turned the phone screen toward her. It was a message from the personnel running the entry log cross-reference. One line, time-stamped 30 seconds ago. Kessler entry log flagged. He was in the building this morning. Level 2 entry 0605. 9 minutes before Whitmore signed in. Maya looked at the timestamp, 6:05, 9 minutes before her, which meant Drew Kessler, the clearance administrator who had accessed the SAO mandate file, who had left his apartment 11 days ago without making arrangements for his cat, who had not answered his phone when Pharaoh's personnel called, had been inside this building this morning, and was, as far as the entry log showed, still inside it now. Pharaoh was already moving. She didn't run. Federal investigators don't run in corridors because running creates panic in a building that currently had enough disruption without adding visual alarm to it. But she moved with the specific velocity of someone who has made a decision and is executing it without the intermediate step of deliberating. She had 2 personnel with her inside 4 seconds, both redirected from their current positions with single-sentence instructions that Maya caught as she fell into step beside her. Building lockdown, Pharaoh said into her phone. Full facility. Nobody exits without a physical credential check and a face match. Level 2 priority sweep, starting from the administrative wing. She listened for a moment. I don't care what time it is or who has a lunch appointment. Lock it down. She ended the call. He could have left already, Maya said. Not arguing. Establishing the possibility so they were operating on accurate parameters rather than optimistic ones. Entry log shows a badge swipe in, no badge swipe out. He could have exited through a secondary access point without badging. He could have, Pharaoh said. But if he came in this morning, specifically this morning, 9 minutes before you, there's a reason. He came here for something, not just to leave. Maya thought about that as they moved through the corridor toward the stairwell. Kessler had been inside this building during her entire morning, while she was on level 4, pouring coffee, presenting evidence, watching Hale's composure disintegrate. Kessler had been somewhere below her, in the building's lower administrative structure, with access to a level 2 clearance and knowledge of an SAO investigation that was supposed to be airtight. She thought about what you come into a building to do when you know an investigation is closing around the person you've been working for. You come to clean something, or to take something, or to destroy something before it can be found. The stairwell door opened onto Level 2's main corridor, and 2 of Pharaoh's personnel were already visible at the far end, moving methodically through the administrative wing in the way of people who have been trained to clear space. The corridor was quieter than Level 4 had been, lower classification, mostly support and administrative function, the kind of wing that keeps a complex running without being involved in what the complex is running. The administrative wing branched left. Document management, records access, clearance processing, Kessler's home territory for however long he had worked here, the corridors and rooms of a man who had processed other people's classified documents for years and had at some point, specific moment, specific decision, decided that processing could be a two-way operation. Pharaoh's radio crackled. One of her personnel in the wing low and controlled. Room 214, doors closed. Badge reader shows last access at 0618. 0618. 13 minutes after Kessler had entered the building. He'd come in, cleared the main checkpoint, walked directly to room 214, and had been inside it for 3.5 hours. Pharaoh looked at Maya. Document destruction suite. Classified material disposal. Maya started moving before Pharaoh finished the sentence. Room 214 was a standard issue disposal and shredding suite, the kind of room that exists in every facility that processes classified material, equipped with industrial cross-cut shredders, secure burn bags, and a physical access log maintained separately from the digital entry system. The door had a standard cipher lock with a badge reader, and the badge reader was showing Kessler's last access as the only access this morning. Pharaoh's personnel were flanking the door when they arrived. Pharaoh looked at them. A nod. One personnel punched an override code into the cipher lock, a master access code that existed precisely for situations where a room needed to be opened without the occupant's cooperation. The lock disengaged. The door opened. Drew Kessler was standing at the far end of the room with his back to them, feeding documents into the second of two industrial shredders running simultaneously. The noise of the machines had covered the sound of the override in the door. He was still feeding pages when the room's air pressure changed with the door opening, and when he turned around, his expression was not the expression of someone caught off guard. It was the expression of someone who had known this was coming and had decided how much time they needed. He was 51 years old, medium build, the kind of face that had never been memorable, which had probably served him well for most of his career. He was holding a manila folder that still had pages in it, and both shredders were still running, and he looked at Pharaoh and Maya and the two personnel in the doorway with the specific expression of someone running a rapid calculation about how many more pages they can get through. "Stop," Pharaoh said. He fed 2 more pages into the shredder. "Mr. Kessler." Her voice was flat and absolute. "Step away from the machine." He stopped. Not because he'd finished, the folder in his hand still had thickness to it, but because the math had resolved. 2 federal agents, 2 support personnel, a locked room, and a building in lockdown. He had done what he could with the time he had, and the time was up. He set the folder on top of the shredder. He stepped back. One of Pharaoh's personnel moved immediately to the shredders and cut the power. The room went significantly quieter without the machine noise. The other personnel moved to Kessler, and there was a brief procedural exchange, hands, pockets, a physical pat-down conducted with the efficiency of practice, while Pharaoh crossed the room to the folder Kessler had set down. She looked at what remained inside it without touching the pages, reading their headers in the available light. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. Maya looked at Kessler. He was watching Pharaoh read the folder with the expression of a man assessing the damage. Not remorseful, not frightened exactly, but calculating. Estimating how much was gone and how much remained and what the ratio meant for his specific situation. "How long?" Maya said. He looked at her. He didn't know who she was by sight, she could see that, but he understood from her presence in this room, standing beside Pharaoh, that she was not administrative support. "How long have you been passing information to Meridian?" she said. The name landed on his face like a hand on a table, quick and flat and definitive. She watched his calculation shift. The name told him the investigation was further along than he'd assessed, and the adjustment showed. "I'd like an attorney," he said. "You'll have one," Pharaoh said, without looking up from the folder. "You're going to want a very good one." She looked up. "You just destroyed classified documents during an active federal investigation. That's a charge before we even get to whatever brought you here this morning. I want an attorney before I say anything else." "That's your right," Pharaoh said. She closed the folder carefully. "Cuff him." Her personnel moved. Kessler didn't resist. He had the specific non-resistance of someone who had arrived at the moment they'd been preparing for. Not surprised by it, not fighting it, simply moving into the reality of it, because fighting was a form of energy expenditure that would cost more than it returned. As Pharaoh's personnel walked him toward the door, he passed Maya. He stopped, not forcefully, just pausing in the movement, and looked at her. "You were the one on level 4, yeah," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd been in the building. He'd heard something through administrative channels or building comms or the informal current that moves through any workplace when something significant is happening. She looked at him. "The server," he said quietly. "The morning briefing." "Yes," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. There was something in his face she couldn't fully categorize. Not regret, not apology, but something that sat in the vicinity of those things without quite being them. The expression of a person who has, in this specific moment, encountered the human consequence of what they've been doing and found it to be more concrete than abstraction had allowed. Then he was through the door, and Pharaoh's personnel were moving him down the corridor, and the room was quieter still. Pharaoh was on her radio, relaying the status of the document destruction, requesting forensic personnel to recover the shredder bins and attempt reconstruction of the destroyed materials. It was not a guaranteed recovery. Industrial cross-cut shredders were designed specifically to defeat reconstruction, but partial recovery was possible, and partial was better than nothing. Maya looked at the two shredders. She thought about what had been fed into them over the course of 3.5 hours. Communication records, access logs, documents that connected Kessler to Meridian in ways the investigation hadn't yet found. The domestic threat of a foreign intelligence operation that had been running long enough to kill 19 soldiers across 2 operations and would have continued running if a woman in a gray service uniform hadn't walked into Secure Conference 7 with a recorder in her jacket. She thought about how much was gone, and then she thought about the safe deposit box, Box 441. The encrypted device with Hale's complete communication record, every date, every data transfer, everything he'd documented, and the accumulated weight of what he'd been carrying. Kessler could destroy paper. He couldn't destroy what was inside that box. The warrant was in process. The building was locked down. The attorney for Hale was 8 minutes out. She walked out of room 214 and back toward the stairwell. The formal proceedings began at 1400 hours and continued into the evening in the way of federal processes. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but relentless. One room after another, one interview after another. The careful, methodical architecture of accountability being constructed piece by people who understood that the quality of the construction would determine whether it held. Hale gave his formal statement with his attorney present. He was thorough, he was specific. He named dates and file numbers and transfer amounts and the exact phrasing of 11 Meridian communications he had memorized because he had read them enough times that they had become involuntary. He described the Darkfall operation with the precision of a man who had spent months trying not to remember it clearly and had failed. The warrant for Box 441 was executed at 1620. The encrypted device inside it was transferred to DYA forensic analysis by 1700. The first preliminary extraction from the device, partial, incomplete enough, confirmed 11 distinct communication events between Hale and the Meridian identifier. 7 of those events predated Carrion Ridge. 3 occurred in the 48-hour window surrounding the mission. 1 occurred 4 days after. The one 4 days after was 3 words: confirm, clean exit. Maya was shown the extraction report in the Level 2 secure communications room at 1815, sitting across from a DIA forensic analyst named Barlow, who had the tired-eyed focus of someone who has been looking at encrypted data for 11 hours and has another 11 ahead of him. She read the 3 words on the report and sat with them for a moment. Confirm, clean exit. Someone had told Meridian that Carrion Ridge was clean, that the cover story was in place, That 8 dead soldiers and 1 survivor extracted under hostile conditions and sent to a hospital in Germany with a bullet in her shoulder was, from the operational betrayal perspective, a clean exit. She set the report down. "The Darkfall names," she said. "The 11. Barlow nodded. "We have 9 confirmed from the device data, cross-referencing with classified mission archives for the remaining 2. We should have a complete list by tomorrow morning." "I need them tonight," she said. Barlow looked at her. He had the expression of someone who was going to say, "That's not how the timeline works," and then looked at her face and reconsidered. "I'll have what I can to Deputy Director Farrow by 2100, he said. "Thank you," she said. She meant it plainly, without performance, and he received it the same way. Kessler was formally charged at 1900 hours. Destruction of classified materials during an active federal investigation. Unauthorized disclosure of classified information. The additional charges, the ones that would come when the forensic reconstruction and the cross-referencing with Hale's device data established the full scope of his role, were pending, but pending in the specific way of things that are coming rather than things that might come. He had not said anything beyond his request for an attorney. His attorney, who arrived at 1830 and spent 40 minutes reviewing the situation, came out of the first conference with the expression of someone who has just been handed a considerably larger problem than their client described over the phone. Admiral Caldwell remained in the building until 1930. He had spent the afternoon in a series of briefings that Maya was not present for. The command structure briefings, the damage assessment sessions, the conversations that happen when an institution discovers the size of what has been happening inside it. When he came back through the level 4 corridor on his way out, he passed the communications room where Maya was reviewing the preliminary device extraction, and he stopped. She looked up. He came to the doorway. He didn't come in. "The field-level breach characterization," he said. "I signed the report. I want you to know that I understand what that means." "I know you do," she said. "It means families were told a version of events that wasn't true. Families of 8 soldiers who had earned better than that." "Yes," she said. "That will be corrected," he said. "Formally. Every family. Personally, if they want it. That's a commitment I'm making tonight, not a process I'm initiating." She looked at him. The Admiral, with his 61 years and his immaculate uniform and the weight of a morning he was going to carry for however many years he had left. "There was a soldier named Roy Calloway," she said. "He had a retirement date. He was going back to New Mexico to build a fence. He has a wife named Sandra and a daughter who's 13. She paused. "Start with her." Caldwell nodded once. He left. So, the joint investigation authorization was filed the following morning, folding the Darkfall scope and the Meridian Handler thread into a multi-agency framework that brought in NSA and FBI counterintelligence alongside the DIA. It was the correct structure. Maya had known it was coming and had prepared herself for the transition. The specific adjustment of moving from the investigator who built the case to one participant among many in the structure that follows. It was not a comfortable adjustment, but she made it because the adjustment wasn't about her comfort, and she had never confused those two things. The formal congressional notification came 4 days later. A classified briefing to the relevant oversight committee, conducted by Farrow and 2 senior DIA officials, presenting the full scope of what had been found: 2 operations, 19 soldiers, a systematic program of intelligence compromise, a domestic network of 3 individuals, of which only 2 were in custody, and a foreign handler whose identity remained under active investigation. Maya was not in the congressional briefing. She was in a different room, a conference room on the 3rd floor of the DIA headquarters building in Bethesda, sitting across from 3 people she had not met before: a deputy assistant secretary, a senior legal counsel, and the director of the Special Assessment Office, whose name was Pryor, and who was in his 60s with the particular quality of someone who has spent decades doing important work in deliberately unremarkable settings. They offered her a chair. She sat. "The SAO mandate closes with the Carrion Ridge matter formally resolved," Pryor said. He had a flat, precise way of speaking that she appreciated. The Darkfall expansion and the Meridian thread moved to joint investigation. You're aware of that? Yes, sir. Your operational work on the mandate is complete. Your testimony will be required at various points in the formal proceedings against Hale and Kessler, and the documentation you compiled will form the evidentiary backbone of both cases. He paused. You did exceptionally precise work. I had 11 months, she said. You had 11 months. A level 5 clearance, and a personal stake that would have compromised most investigators, he said. It didn't compromise you. She thought about that. About the nights in the borrowed Arlington apartment, when it had been very close to compromising her, when the names of 8 people had been so loud in the space behind her eyes that the methodical accumulation of evidence had felt like an insult to the urgency of what she knew, when patient and precise had been the hardest 2 words in her vocabulary. It almost did, she said. A few times. Pryor looked at her. He had the expression of someone who respects an honest answer more than a clean one. What I want to discuss, he said, is what comes next. The Deputy Assistant Secretary leaned forward slightly. The joint investigation has identified a systematic vulnerability in the domestic security clearance process, specifically in the administrative clearance structure. The SAO has been tasked with developing a counterintelligence protocol to address that vulnerability. A new unit, small, 6 to 8 people maximum, specifically selected. He paused. We'd like you to lead it. Maya looked at him. The unit would focus on internal threat identification, Pryor said. Not counter-espionage in the broad sense, specifically the human layer. The administrative and procedural access points that get overlooked because they're not high profile, not glamorous, not the kind of thing that gets prioritized until someone exploits them. He paused. The Kessler problem. Systematized, anticipated, and addressed before the next time. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the document destruction suite, room 214, the 2 shredders running simultaneously for 3.5 hours while she had been 1 floor above, presenting evidence about Carry-On Ridge. The pages that were gone, that forensic reconstruction had partially recovered and partially lost. The gap in the record that would always exist because a clearance administrator had spent a morning in a room designed to make things disappear. She thought about Dominic Reyes, who had noticed a colonel in Kandahar saying something offhand about his team looking like they'd aged 5 years, who had thought it was worth remembering, who had told her because he thought it was funny, and because he told her things, and because that was the kind of person he was, someone who paid attention to the details that didn't seem to matter until they did. She thought about Roy Calloway's fence in New Mexico, unbuilt, about Dale Harmon's marksmanship qualification, 1 month before the deployment, about Jasmine Tran, 22 years old, carbine stripped and reassembled in under 40 seconds. She thought about the specific thing that had gotten 19 people killed across 2 operations, the assumption that the threat was external, that the perimeter was the problem, that if you secured the high-profile access points, the administrative layer was background noise. The unit, she said. Reporting to whom? SAO Direct, with joint oversight from the DIA Counterintelligence Division, Pryor said. You'd have operational autonomy within the mandate, budget, personnel selection, methodology. Your call, with quarterly review. Personnel selection, she said. I want Marsh. Pryor glanced at the Deputy Assistant Secretary. A brief exchange of looks. Captain Marsh is currently assigned to... I know where she's assigned, Maya said. She spent 6 hours in a classified briefing this morning taking notes that held up under evidentiary review. She asked the right questions at the right moments, and she didn't say anything she needed to walk back. I want her. She paused. I also want the analyst who kept the copy of the signals report, the one who held it for 11 months because she didn't want it to disappear. She's a protected witness now, but after the trial phase, her protection status changes. I want her in the unit. Pryor looked at her with the expression of someone who had expected a negotiation and was receiving a personnel list instead. I can bring those names to the authorization committee, he said. I'd appreciate that, she said. He nodded. Then, pending committee review, the unit lead position is yours. He leaned back slightly. There's one more thing. The The formal recognition component. The investigative work you completed under the SAO mandate will be entered into the official record with your full name and rank. There will be a formal commendation. It will be classified, but it will be real and it will be permanent. She looked at him. What about the 19? Every name, he said. Official record, unclassified citation, family notification. That process begins this week. She sat with that for a moment. 19 names in an official record, not buried in a classified annex, not footnoted under administrative review language. Named, cited, honored. The actual word that the military uses when it means to acknowledge the full weight of what someone gave. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. She understood that with the clarity of a person who has lived inside not enough for 11 months and has stopped waiting for it to become something else. The fence in New Mexico would not get built. Jasmine Tran would not turn 23. Those things were permanent losses, and the justice that followed them was a different category of thing. Not healing, not replacement, but a refusal to let those losses be swallowed by the institution that had failed to prevent them. Refusal was something she could work with. I'll take the position, she said. The Hale trial began 7 weeks later. It was federal, it was classified in its most sensitive portions, and it moved with the deliberate pace of serious proceedings that carry serious weight. The evidence package Maya had built formed the core of the prosecution's case. 43 minutes of audio, the terrain analysis comparison, the financial forensics, the device extraction, the access logs, the signals report that had been buried and then recovered. He pled guilty on the 14th day. Not to all charges, his attorney negotiated the structure, but to the espionage charge, the central one, the one that named what he had done without the buffer of euphemism or procedural language. He stood in the courtroom and said, I leaked classified operational coordinates. 8 soldiers died because of my actions. He did not say it was enough. He did not look like a man who believed saying it was enough. He looked like a man who understood that saying it was the only available form of honesty left to him, and who had decided that honesty at this stage was worth more than its alternatives. Maya was not in the courtroom. She was in a facility in Bethesda in the 3rd week of building the unit that would become, over the following months, the most effective internal threat identification program the SAO had ever operated. She heard about the plea from Pharaoh over the phone at 11:20 in the morning while she was reviewing personnel files at her desk. She sat with it for 30 seconds. Then she picked up the file she'd been reading and kept working. Kessler pled guilty 3 weeks after Hale. His charges included the document destruction, the unauthorized disclosure, and 2 counts of conspiracy that the forensic reconstruction had established despite the partial shredding. His attorney's argument that he had been approached and leveraged, that the initial contact had exploited a financial situation rather than a pre-existing intent to betray, was entered into the sentencing documentation as Hale had requested for himself. It was not exculpatory. It was context. Context mattered. Maya had learned that. Context didn't absolve, but it was honest. And honesty about how these things happened, the specific human mechanisms of vulnerability and exploitation, and the slow accumulation of choices, was the only way to understand them well enough to prevent the next one. The Meridian handler identity was established through the joint investigation 4 months later, traced through 6 intermediate entities to a signals intelligence officer in a foreign agency. The diplomatic channel was invoked. The outcome of that invocation was classified above Maya's current access level. She was told the channel had been disrupted. She chose to believe it because there was no productive alternative and because she had enough actual work in front of her to fill a career. On a Thursday in October, 10 months after the morning, in Secure Conference 7, Maya was at her desk at 0700 when Marsh knocked on the open door of the office they shared in the SAO Division's Bethesda facility. Marsh had been in the unit for 6 months and had become the thing Maya had seen potential for in that Level 4 conference room. Someone who documented without editorializing, asked the right questions at the right moments, and understood that the work was the work and the recognition of the work were separate things that didn't need to be conflated. The family notification list, Marsh said. She was holding a folder. The last 2 from Darkfall. The families have been contacted. The formal citations were delivered yesterday. She paused. That's all 19. Maya looked up from her desk. All 19, she said. All 19, Marsh confirmed. Maya sat with that the way you sit with something you have been moving toward for a long time. Not the dramatic arrival she might have imagined at the beginning, not a moment that dissolved the weight or resolved the grief into something cleaner. Just a fact becoming real. 19 names in a formal record, 19 families with a piece of paper that said, with the authority of the institution that had failed their soldier, we know what happened, and we know who was responsible, and we will not describe this as anything other than what it was. She thought about Dominic Reyes coaching soccer in Albuquerque, about Dale Harmon's advanced marksmanship qualification, about Roy Calloway's fence. She thought about a mountainside in Kunar province in November, and the specific quality of cold at that altitude, and the 8 hours she had spent in it before the extraction team arrived, and the weight of what she had carried out of that mountain and into every room she'd entered since. Thank you, she said to Marsh. Marsh nodded and stepped back from the doorway without making it a moment, which was what Maya appreciated about her. The understanding that some things don't need to be extended. Maya looked at her desk. Personnel files. A methodology review for the unit's second quarter. A preliminary assessment of 3 administrative access points in 3 facilities that had been flagged by the unit's new internal screening protocol. Work that existed because of what had happened, designed to prevent the next version of what had happened, operated by people who understood that the next version was not a hypothetical. She had spent 11 months in a gray service uniform with a recorder smaller than a pen cap, being invisible in rooms full of people who had decided she was not worth looking at. She had poured coffee for men who were deciding what to call the deaths of her friends. She had listened to the institutional machinery of a cover story being maintained, and she had documented every word, and she had waited with the patience of someone who understood that patience was not passivity, but a form of precision, the choice to act at the moment when acting produces the most durable result rather than the most immediate satisfaction. She thought about what she had learned in that time, not the tactical lessons. She'd had those before. The other ones. The ones about the specific texture of being dismissed, about the way invisibility works in both directions, the thing you lose when people stop looking at you, and the thing you gain. About the way institutional authority functions when it doesn't recognize itself in the person standing in front of it. She had been in rooms where she held more information than anyone else, and been ordered to leave. She had been called support staff by people who signed documents she had already read. She had been told to put down the carafe and exit, and she had stood still and said, I'm going to stay a few more minutes, and the world had not ended. It had in fact expanded. She was not a person who dealt in lessons cleanly extracted from suffering. She understood that the 11 months and the 11 months before them, the mountainside, the hospital, the borrowed apartment in Arlington, had cost her things she would not get back, and that no amount of institutional recognition or operational authority changed the arithmetic of those losses. Roy Calloway's fence was still unbuilt. Those were permanent facts. But she was here, working. With personnel she had selected and trusted. With a mandate that had teeth and a structure that took seriously the administrative layer that everyone before her had treated as background. With 19 names in a formal record, seen and acknowledged by the institution that had spent 11 months trying not to see them. She picked up the first personnel file on her desk. She kept working. Because that was the thing. The thing she had understood on the mountainside and had carried forward through everything that followed. The work didn't stop. There was always another briefing, another building, another person in a gray service uniform who knew more than anyone in the room was prepared to credit them with. Another Kessler waiting in an administrative wing, another set of shredders running, another gap between what the institution knew and what it was willing to look at. Her job was the gap. She had earned the right to work it. Not because she had survived and not because she had been recognized, but because she was the person who understood, in her bones and her scar tissue and the 4 seconds she counted between receiving information and acting on it, what lived in the space between invisible and dangerous. And she was very, very good at her job.